information to go from a bacteria to human is that the genome, okay, all the genetic information there, would be larger. You'd have more of it. And you'd have more genes as you sort of go up the evolutionary ladder or the tree from very simple to complex, from bacteria to human beings. Now, so if that's true, let's take a look at it. We should be able to look at the DNA. We know how much DNA is in a lot of organisms now. We've sequenced a lot of these. So let's look and see if that's actually borne out. Let's look at the sizes first. Okay, Mycoplasma genitalium is a bacteria that has one of the smallest known genomes at 580,000 bases. We then go to Helicobacter pylori, which is the bacteria responsible for causing ulcers. We'll talk about that one a little bit later, 1.7 million. Okay, we go to the fly, common fruit fly, about 122 million. Okay, so we're going up, definitely here. Rice, okay, I kind of throw this one in, it's a plant, 390 million. All right, so we're getting a little more complex there. Now human, 3.3 billion. So now we've jumped from millions to billions. Wow, well, so far so good. I mean, as we're going from simple, so to speak, to complex here, we're getting more genetic information. Looks good. Oh, well, here's the problem. Frogs, amphibians, actually have about 1,000 billion bases. Okay, now, some people might, and I would definitely say we're more complex than frogs. Now, some people might have issues with that. They might say, well, complexity is really kind of a relative term, and how do you really know that, we're more complex than frogs? Well, I'm going to kind of paraphrase a quote from Lee Spetner in his book, Not by Chance, and say that when frogs start classifying themselves and everything else, they can put themselves at the top of the ladder. But until then, it's us, okay? So, this is a problem, okay? Amphibians have way more DNA than we do, okay? So it doesn't work, it doesn't fit. Now, what's also interesting, if you look at the number of genes, okay, I said before, humans have about 20 to 25,000. Rice, okay, think about it, rice, simple little grain rice, 38,000 genes. They have more genes than we do. Hey, rice. That doesn't seem to be any comparison there. They have way more genes. So, so far, this isn't working out very well for the evolutionists. There isn't more genetic information. There is more DNA, period. There isn't more genes. I mean, there doesn't seem to be this continuity, so to speak, that you would expect. I want to look at a really extreme example that I found I think is really cool. This is the whisk fern, okay? Looks pretty simple. It has no true leaves, no true flowers, and no true fruit. It is a plant, but it doesn't have any of those things. You want to know how big its genome is? 250 billion bases. Okay? This is about as simple of a plant as you get, and it has this huge, huge genome. Now, when you look up information on this, it will say, well, about 80% of that genome is actually what we say is called repetitive, meaning it's the same sequence over and over and over and over again. And one website I found said it contains no genetic information, obviously, in that 80%. Well, how do you know that? Because of their evolutionary presuppositions that the genome is the result of random processes, it doesn't contain information, and they won't even look at it. They won't even look at its role in the life of an organism, which really inhibits the scientists. Science, they say, well, creationists inhibit, they just say God did it and that's it. Well, no, we don't, first of all. But second, I mean, that's really sad because that's really inhibiting science to say, well, I don't think it has a function because of my evolutionary presupposition, so I'm not even going to look at it. I think it has a function because it's the result of an intelligent designer. So what we're seeing here is a lot of what we call discontinuity. We're seeing that each thing was designed specifically, and it's designed for a purpose, and what it does do well, okay? It's not one thing evolved from the other. And not only do we see this in the genome sizes and the number of genes and things like that, we also see this in the junk DNA. Now, I said before, about 2% of our DNA codes for proteins. So what does the other 98% do? Okay, now for years and years and years, this has been called junk DNA. It was first coined, the term, back in 1972 by a geneticist who had this to say about junk DNA. The earth is strewn with fossil remains of extinct species. Is it a wonder that our genome too is filled with the remains of extinct genes. So basically, as you go from a bacteria to a human being, well, you expect some things to, not be really needed by a human being or the next organism up the ladder, so it just sort of stays there and, it doesn't really do anything anymore. It gets mutations, and it's just a leftover, an evolutionary leftover. Okay, so here's the thing. Is junk DNA really junk? Now, some exciting new results recently came out from a project called ENCODE, which stands for the Encyclopedia of DNA Elements. And what they did was they studied 1% of the human genome. Okay, I want you to keep that in mind. 1%. And what they're studying is the junk. Okay? They're studying the stuff in between. And here's a quote saying what they found. We are now seeing the majority of the rest of the genome is active to some extent. I don't know how many papers they published in relationship to this, just telling us what they think 1% of it does, okay? 1%. Now they're really excited. They want to study the other 99% because guess what? It does something. It's functional. It has a role. Some of it may actually be transcribed and translated into proteins. They didn't think this before. They think it's added on to the stuff that comes from our genes. It's added on to proteins. Some of it's involved in how the DNA winds up and ends up in the nucleus. Some of it's involved in regulating how we go from DNA to RNA. Some of it's involved in replicating the DNA. I mean, just function after function after function. Some of it they still don't know what it does, but they're pretty sure it's important. Now, so we would expect this. As creationists, this is like, yes, okay, this is what we've been saying all along. We would expect this. Now, here's the thing. If this junk DNA is functional, then one would expect it to be conserved across species that are evolutionary related. Like if you look at all mammals, you would expect, since supposedly they came from a common ancestor, that they would all have very similar junk DNA. Okay, let's see if that's what they actually found, because they did some studies on this. Now, we're going to look at this using a completely fictitious sequence, because in the papers themselves, they don't publish actual sequences that they actually looked at for this, and they don't specifically name the mammals that they studied. But they do talk about this in relationship to mammals specifically. But let's look at this, and I want to illustrate to you what the finding was. Is junk DNA conserved? So let's look at a whale, a mouse, a cat, a dog, a chimp, and a human. Okay. So what did they find? Well, when they looked at the same portion of the genome and all of these organisms, and they looked at the junk DNA that's now considered to have some sort of function, they found that 50% of it was indeed conserved. 50% of those elements were conserved. And I kind of illustrate that here. Those in yellow kind of show you that if you looked at all of those genomes and basically the same approximate location, the junk DNA would be very, very similar, 50% of the time. So if 50% is conserved, what does that mean about the other 50%? It's not. They don't like this. And it's really interesting when you read the papers. You can just tell they're having a really hard time with this. And in fact, the main paper on this particular project that came out was in the magazine called Nature. And at the very end, they said the most surprising result of this study was that, in other words, 50% of it's not conserved. That's the most surprising thing to them. They don't like it. They don't know how to deal with it. And for a creationist, it makes total sense. It shows discontinuity between the organisms. They always talk about how, chimps and human DNA is so similar. Well, a lot of that is in the genes, and you would expect the genes to be similar. We also have 50% similarity to a banana, okay? But no one thinks we're evolutionarily related to a banana. You would expect it. If you want to do a certain function in a chimp and a human, and it's the same function, it makes sense to use the same protein, okay? But where the differences might lie is how much, when, where, the regulation of it, maybe adding bits and pieces to it. And so that's what's in the junk, quote unquote, okay? That makes sense. That's what we would expect. So they still have to explain this, though, somehow, right? They've got to come up with some explanation. Has to sort of fit into the theory. So what are they going to come up with? Well, here's what they've come up with so far. This is from the European Bioinformatics Institute, an individual there. He says this. He says, I think of them as gate crashers at a party. In other words, he's talking about functional, I'm going to keep calling it junk DNA because that makes the most sense still right now. Functional junk DNA, which is not conserved, the 50% that doesn't match. They appeared by chance over evolutionary time, neither to the organisms genome's benefit nor to its hindrance. Now, the Nature paper actually said that maybe, and I quote, "This pool may serve as a warehouse for natural selection." Okay. So now we're going to say, well, hey, I need some genetic variation here to make this work, so I'm going to pull this piece out of the junk DNA and I'm going to use it for some variation here. Okay. Besides the fact that there's a huge amount of problems with that particular concept and how that would actually work, evolution doesn't keep things with the idea of, ooh, maybe in the future I can use that, okay? Evolution is goalless, it's purposeless. If it doesn't work right now, it will not keep it, okay? It's gone. So that doesn't work. And so again, you can see the hard time they're having with what they found. And what I'm really hoping is that we don't go back to square one with this, because they're saying it has a function, but it's not important. So I'm worried about whether or not they're really going to study it further because of that. And so we'll have to see what happens with that. So for every question we ask and answer about the genome, we have about 1,000 more that become prevalent and relevant. And it's the proverbial Pandora's box, so to speak. We've really opened it, and now we have to deal with this. Now, again, we've looked at genomes, we've looked at junk DNA, and it's not working for the evolutionists very well. It's working very, very well for us. It's confirming what we know from the Bible, and that's great, and that's what we would expect. But we now want to turn our attention to mutation and natural selection, because these are really the two big guns, so to speak, that evolution uses that you hear a lot. And again, remember, genetic information increase is required for molecules to man evolution. Now, I said again, we discussed this in respect to genome sizes and the number of genes, but how do we actually accomplish this? Again, we're seeing it doesn't really work well for the evolutionists, but how can this really be accomplished? And it can be accomplished by natural selection and mutation, well, at least according to evolutionary thought. Now, what do they really accomplish? Okay? Now, not probably what, again, evolutionary ideas say they accomplish. What do they really accomplish? Let's look first at natural selection. Natural selection is cited as a mechanism used by evolution to add genetic information. Okay? They've got to have a way to add it if you're going to go from a bacteria to a human being. Problem. It doesn't. Okay? Natural selection leads to a loss of genetic information, and this is something we can study and know in the here and now. Now, I don't have a problem with natural selection. I'm a big fan of natural selection. Okay? I believe it happens. We can see it happening, but only within a created kind, only within dogs or cats or bacteria or whatever it may be. I have a much bigger problem with it on a larger scale because we just don't see that happening between the kinds. Now, the idea of natural selection was actually first proposed by a creationist, Edward Blyth, and it was actually hijacked by the evolutionists and popularized by Darwin. Okay? So, again, creationists in general do not have a problem with natural selection. We can see it happening. The problem is taking it and trying to apply it to going from chimps to humans, so to speak. Now, the example that we're going to look at to help us really illustrate this is basically how natural selection decreases information within the dog kind. Now, as we go from the wolf, so to speak, which is a more basic kind of dog, to the Chihuahua, we're going to get less information, less genetic information. Now, by saying this, I don't mean that they're necessarily getting less DNA or less genes. They're getting less variety of those genes. For example, a wolf might have genes for short fur and long fur. A Chihuahua might only have a gene for short fur. Okay? So it's not losing actual DNA, it's just losing the variety within that DNA. Now, as you get more and more purebreds, like Chihuahuas, like poodles, which is Ken's favorite example, as you get more and more purebred dogs, the less variety you get. I mean, that's kind of the whole point. That's why they call them purebred. The more desirable traits you get generation after generation after generation. But also the more problems you start to have, the more diseases show up. That's the same reason you don't marry your first cousin, okay? You're too closely related, genetically speaking, okay? So, and so that becomes a problem. So again, you're getting less information. You're not getting more, you're not increasing, you're decreasing. Now let's look at this again in a sort of another example here, looking at fur length. Let's say we start out with some sort of basic type of dog here, and they have two variations, a gene for long fur and a gene for short fur. Okay, that's their genetic makeup. They have two, just like we would have two for hair color, eye color, whatever it may be. And you mate those two dogs. Okay, what are the possible offspring? Okay, well, you have lots of possible offspring. You could have a dog that has short fur. Okay, so he has two S's, he inherited the two S's. A medium fur dog that inherited an L from one parent and an S from another parent from the other parent. Or you could have a long fur dog which inherited both the L's. Okay, so those are the three possibilities that you could have. Now, if you take the long fur dog and mate it with another long fur dog, okay, what are the possible offspring? Long fur, okay? You're not getting short. Okay? That gene, that variety of that particular fur length does not exist anymore. The S is gone. It's out of the picture, so to speak. You're only going to get long fur dogs. Now, if these dogs live in the Arctic, where it's very, very cold, or up in Siberia or somewhere like that, then hey, this is great. Okay, they want long fur, okay, because it keeps them warm. Now, should the environment change, or should those dogs be moved to another location, say Africa, it's going to become a problem, because they don't have the genetic information that will allow them to go back to the short fur. Okay, it's gone. It's no longer there. So you're getting a reduction in the variety of genes available, a reduction of genetic information, not more. This is what natural selection does. Okay, you're getting less and less, not more and more. Now, I want to use a quote from Eugenie Scott, and for those of you who don't know who she is, she's the director for the National Center for Science Education, and she's very much an anti-creationist and pro-evolutionist, especially when it comes to the school system. And I don't usually quote her in a positive way, but I really, really like what she had to say about science in general, and I want to share that with you because she shares a couple questions, and I want to use those to help us evaluate what we've learned here about natural selection. She says this: now, what about science? I think I'd be satisfied if Americans would get into two habits. First, ask, is there another explanation? After we get people into the habit of asking, is there another explanation, we next need to get them to ask, how do I tell which explanation is better? I totally agree. Those are really, really good questions to ask there, Dr. Scott. Okay, so kind of paraphrasing those questions with what we're dealing with here, is natural selection an explanation for how evolution could occur? No. Okay? It doesn't work because it decreases genetic information, it doesn't increase it. So it's not an explanation.